amendment offered by the gentleman from California. The question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Gentlemen.
Nays, please.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. It's now in order to consider amendment number 448, printed in Part 8 of House Report 117405. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 448, printed in Part A of House Report number 117-405, offered by Mr. Green of Texas.
To House Resolution 1224, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, and a member opposed. Each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield myself 1.5 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, today I rise in strong support of reforming the Disaster Recovery Act, which I have submitted as an amendment, number 448, to the National Defense Authorization Act. This amendment would permanently authorize the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, which provides states, tribes, and communities with flexible long-term recovery resources needed to rebuild affordable housing and infrastructure after a disaster. The amendment also provides important safeguards and tools to help ensure that federal disaster recovery efforts reach all impacted households, including the lowest income and most marginalized survivors who are often hardest hit by disasters and have the fewest resources to recover. The amendment also provides important safeguards and tools to help ensure that federal disaster recovery efforts reach all impacted households in the future, including the lowest income and most marginalized survivors. These measures would help to prevent the repetition of what happened in Texas in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, where more than 4 years after the disaster, relief funds that were appropriated by Congress have not filtered down to the hands of people who need them. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Louisiana, for what purpose does he seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I got to tell you, coming from a disaster-prone state, I'm absolutely shocked that anyone would propose an amendment like this. Here it is, 1:15 a.m., a 48-page amendment is being offered to codify or memorialize a process that has done nothing but re-victimize disaster victims in the aftermath of a hurricane or other type of natural disaster. Mr. Speaker, in 2016, this Congress provided about $1.7 billion in the aftermath of a disaster, about $1.7 billion, trying to help out those who were impacted by a 1,000-year flood, trying to get money in their hands. Yet 6 years later, only 1/3 of those funds had actually been allocated to the disaster victims. Almost $500 million had been paid to the contractors administering the program. Mr. Speaker, HUD is not a disaster agency. Look at the Government Accountability Office reports. They've said over and over again That all you have is this alphabet soup of agencies that aren't coordinated. You have HUD that doesn't have disaster experience. This is a flawed approach. You can look at other programs that are capable of getting money out the door faster. In fact, in this legislation, it actually codifies, it says that you first have to help those in poverty. What if they're not impacted? But it requires that they're first helped. What we need to be doing is we need to be getting assistance in the hands of those that need help. Not in this situation where in 2019, the Government Accountability Office looked at this and said that of funds that have been appropriated in 2015, 4 years prior, that less than 80% of the money had actually even been allocated yet. This agency is the wrong agency. They've got a clear record of complete failure and lack of urgency in simply re-victimizing disaster victims. I urge opposition to this amendment and reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield at this time 1.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Houston, Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend and colleague, Mr. Green, for his leadership on this very important amendment. And I'm not shocked by this amendment. I am pleased with this amendment. This is something that is desperately needed because this amendment would permanently authorize the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. This important program does provide states and communities like mine in Houston with flexible long-term recovery resources for building affordable housing and infrastructure after a disaster. This amendment would ensure that these essential services go to the most deserving communities, those hit hardest by a disaster. It builds safeguards to ensure that funds are not diverted away from the lowest income survivors. Further, it reforms disaster recovery allocation formulas and protocol to ensure equity, prioritizes transparency and oversight in disaster recovery, protects civil rights and fair housing, and supports disaster mitigation efforts. Mr. Green's in my hometown of Houston is no stranger to disasters. And Mr. Speaker, I would submit that if the folks on the other side of the aisle think that this is not a good program and they don't want the dollars because it takes them too long to get them, we'll gladly accept them in Houston because we get hit almost every year, every other year. We get hit hard, and we get hit in the most vulnerable populations. So again, I urge support of this amendment and urge all my colleagues to do the same.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yield myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, listening to the gentlelady talk about this amendment, it clearly there's a divide between what she's expressing and what this amendment actually does. The gentlelady said that this would help to get the money in the hands of those that are most impacted. That's not what this does. To the contrary, it actually requires that those that are in poverty be prioritized. It doesn't matter if they've been impacted or not. There's not even a requirement in here to determine that they're most impacted. In fact, this amendment actually codifies a low and moderate income requirement that doesn't take into consideration the actual impacts of that person. It also has a provision in here that discusses the impact to households but not individuals. So maybe if you're single, you're not even eligible under this because in some cases it makes reference to individuals. In other cases, only families or households. Mr. Speaker, look, the bottom line, we've been through this program over and over and over again. I'm completely shocked. The sponsor of this amendment, in 2017, when we appropriated $35 billion, his home state of Texas in 2019 had only drawn down $18 million. In the case of Florida, keep in mind, this was in the aftermath of Harvey, Irma, and Maria. In the case of Florida, in 2019, nearly 2 years after the disaster funds had been appropriated, only $1 million had been drawn down. And in the case of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, Zero. This agency is not capable of doing anything other than re-victimizing our disaster victims. It's the wrong agency. It's the wrong program. This language has not been vetted by disaster experts, and all it's going to do is memorialize or codify what we're doing to disaster victims now, which is funding a bureaucracy, funding contractors that profit off of this flawed approach, and simply not helping those get back on their feet that are most in need. Reserve.
Gentleman from Louisiana reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My dear colleague and friend, whom I have great respect for, I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana. I understand the woes of the state and the people. But he and I have a difference in opinion about which committee should have jurisdiction. I sit on the Financial Services Committee. HUD has jurisdiction. He sits on transportation. He wants jurisdiction. He's not going to get it. I reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
I want to thank my friend for actually expressing the real intent behind this. And this is, I think, the jurisdictional desire of the Financial Services Committee